Hi, my name is Kyle and I am a systems engineer with AGI. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at our data source importer inside of our testing and evaluation toolkit. So inside Sdk, with TETK installed, you'll see that we have a Ttk Toolbar here at the top. Today we're going to be focusing on the icon here with the blue arrow pointing downward. That's going to be our data source importer. So go ahead and click on that. Now our data source importer is really where everything starts when we're looking at using TETK. You can leverage TETK both on the pre-flight side in real time and also on the post-flight analysis. When we're looking at the pre-flight side, what you can do is you can model aircraft routes as an example inside Sdk first, and then promote those aircraft to TETK to unlock some of the further capabilities. One other example would be the post-flight analysis side, where you've already completed some type of test event and you now have a bunch of data files related to that test event that you would like to bring into the software for further analysis. In this case, we're going to be looking at a post-flight example, and what I'd like to touch on in the data source importer is actually speak to each of these four buttons that we see along the top here. And I'm just going to go left to right. And you'll actually see that the two here in the middle are grayed out, and those won't be enabled until we first bring in what is called an ownship. So the first button here is our ownship state. The way I like to think of the ownship is it's whatever is your main analysis object. So one example would be you have an aircraft that's flying and there's a radar system on that aircraft, and you're testing how well that system is able to track other nearby aircraft. So in that case, that would be your ownship, and those other aircraft would be what we're going to call associated state objects. So I'll go ahead and click ownship state, and I'm going to navigate to one of our installed directories here for Sdk 12. And we're going to be leveraging some example files that come with TTK install. And for the file path, feel free to look at the top here. Now, if you do have Sdk 11, the file path should basically be the same. You would just have Sdk 11 instead of 12. So these are a bunch of sample files that get included with the TTK install. And these are actually the files that you would leverage if you were to go through our TTK guided training. And you can check that out on our Sdk help page. I'm going to go ahead and choose the ownship.csv, which is a sample aircraft ownship. And as soon as I choose that, we're then prompted with this window. And this is where we can specify certain properties for reading in our ownship object. The first being the ownship identifier, or the name, as well as maybe you have a test number for that particular test event. In this case, I'm just going to keep the defaults of XF1 and 0123. We also have the option of choosing what type of object our ownship is. In this case, like I said, it's going to be an aircraft. We also have the option of using an existing Sdk object or creating a new one. In this case, I'm looking at post-flight, so I'm wanting to bring in just a brand new aircraft based on that data. So I'm going to keep that as new aircraft. Next would be our TSP mapping. Now we'll have another tech tip video that explains data mappings inside TETK, as it's definitely something that's very important and something you want to know. You can also feel free to check out our help page for more information on the mappings. But in summary, mapping is really just a way of telling the software, map this particular column of data from my data file to this particular property inside the software. So for example, the ownship.csv file that I'm reading in has a column called latitude. And so in the mapping, I would specify to match that latitude column of data to the latitude property inside of TETK. The next section is our data reader properties. I'll skip over the name here. We have this unit definition. So every data file that you're bringing in has to have some type of unit associated with each column of data. Now, often that will just be written to the actual file itself. So your first row might be the data column name, and your second row would be the unit that goes with that data. In some cases, files that users are getting out of their system do not have that row of units. Now, you can either add it to the original file, or if that's not an option, what you can do is separately specify a unit definition file. So that's where you would read that in here. Next is our time column dropdown. And if I click on this, you can see these are all of the available columns of data that are in that ownship.csv file. What the software does here is it reads through the file, and it's able to determine which columns are likely to contain actual time information. Now in this case, the file I've read in only has a single column here, and the time is actually in ISO-YD format. But if you had multiple columns of time in your data file, this is where you would choose which one you want to use when reading in that ownship. Lastly, we have data reader time properties. This is where I can specify things such as my time system. If you have a custom time system or you're wanting to apply some type of custom offset to your data, you're able to do that here. We also then have this time type dropdown, which gives me the choice between absolute or relative. Again, it's depending on what type of data you have. In this case, my file has time format of ISOYD, so it's already going to have the year, the month, the day, all the way down to the seconds. So that's going to be an absolute time type. Now, you might have data that is simply epoch seconds from some type of reference epoch, or maybe it's time of day, seconds. In those cases, you would choose relative, and then you can set up your particular epoch and time that that epoch occurs. So I'll set this back to absolute, and I'll go ahead and hit OK. Now, anytime you're reading in a ownership into TTK, it's going to prompt you if you would like to update the time, your scenario start time. And in this case, I'm going to want to do that. If you look in my animation toolbar up here, you'll see that currently my scenario start time is set to today, the day that I'm recording. And what this is asking me to do is if I would like to update the start time of my scenario to match the time interval that is seen in that ownership's data file. So in this case, I'm going to say yes, I would like to do that. I'll hit yes. And I can see that it has now successfully imported. And if I look at my animation toolbar, I can see that it's updated the time to reflect the time interval in my ownership's file. Now that I've read that file in, you can see under available readers, we have a new row that shows up. And so I can see that file, I can see its source path, as well as some additional details. On the right, you'll notice this is basically a view showing all of the columns of data that were in that file. Now, when we're using the ownership state button, really the main information that it's grabbing there is going to be the TSP or the ephemeris information, and that's what was included in the mapping that I had set up. So really just pulling in the position and the attitude information. Now, it is okay to have additional data in those files, because as you can see, it's still going to read in that additional data as well. And what you would see is if you went into the flight analysis tool and wanted to create line contours or graphs, data displays, etc., you would have access to those additional columns of data. Next, we'll move on to our associated state button. And again, I'm just in the installed directory here. I'm going to choose the target1.csv sample file. And I won't go over all of the options in this window because it's very similar to the ownerships one. I'll just call this target1 and hit OK. And we'll see that that has loaded successfully. I now have a second row in my data source importer here pointing to that new source path. And again, on the right, I can see all of the columns of data that were in that particular file. Our third button is our additional data button. And this is essentially used to capture any other type of data files related to your test event that don't specifically contain TSP or ephemeris information. So in the example I have been talking about, we have this ownership aircraft with a radar system tracking multiple different target aircraft. We might have some type of data file that's representing the tracking data from that radar system. So I would load that in here through the additional data button, and then I would move on to the tracks workflow to create actual track inside of TETK from that data. Another example might be having AER pointing information from that ownership to one of the targets. Again, I could bring that in through the additional data button here, move on to the flight analysis tool and create a vector from that AER data. The last button to talk about is our From SDK button. And there's essentially two main options that you have here: attach to an existing TTK object or promote an SDK object to TTK. The first one here, attach to TTK object. What this is doing is, so I've already loaded in this XF1 ownership aircraft. And so I brought along the TSP information. I had some additional data from that file that I brought along. But what I'm able to do here is I'm able to actually drill down into some of the SDK data providers that SDK natively creates with any type of aircraft object. And I'm able to pull those from SDK over into TETK. And that'll allow me to then utilize that data as well inside of the flight analysis tool, and I can look at it side by side with whatever other types of data I have already read in. So I'll go ahead, hit OK, and you'll see here, this then gives me the option of looking into various different SDK data providers and basically just adding whichever ones I want to bring over to TETK over here on the right. I'm just going to keep the default here of bringing in some heading information, and I'll hit OK. You'll see when I do that, that adds a third row here to our data source importer. This time I see it's not pointing to a particular data file. It's actually just coming from software itself, coming from SDK. And let me go back to the From SDK button. And the other option here was that promote SDK object to TE analysis object. Again, way back at the beginning, I mentioned, TTK can cover everything from the pre-flight planning of a test event all the way through to the post-flight analysis. Say you're doing that case where you're looking at a pre-flight, you're creating your route, some type of aircraft route in SDK, and you want to promote that to TTK to do some further analysis. This is one way of doing that here. And as you do that, not only is it promoting it to a TTK ownership, but it also will then allow you to grab hold of any of those SDK data providers that you would like to bring along with it. The very last thing here is then just this show Sdk Readers checkbox, which if I tick that on and then turn it off, you'll see that I'm now only seeing the 2 rows for data files that I had actually read in. And if I check that on, it then will show me the 3rd row there for where I brought in data from the SDK data providers. And that's it for the data source importer. Thank you very much.